everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, professor of English and philosophy. Today we'll look at our final pillar of philosophy. But metaphysics isn't really a pillar. It's much more of a foundation. Nearly every big question in philosophy that has echoed through its hallowed halls since the beginning of man has a metaphysical origin. And without metaphysics to anchor them, the other pillars of philosophy would likely shake and crumble into dust under the vibration of these shouted questions. While we certainly can't walk the entire floor today, we can at least look down some of the endless hallways.
Metaphor works again.
You came up with one more.
I just had this feeling of, I've been indulging myself recently, and I hope people can forgive this if they care at all. But it's just Conan the Barbarian novels. I can't help it. And all of these shrouded, deep areas and buildings and castles and pillars casting deep shadows and monsters coming up. We won't encounter monsters, I think.
No, I don't think so. But you never know. So we'll look at it. What is metaphysics?
The interesting thing about this, and I've been rereading some things this week, and one of my favorite writers is A.C. Grayling, philosopher, writer, and he points out that metaphysics was really the term for philosophy up until about 200 years ago. And philosophy was really essentially science, as we've talked about before. So it's sort of like duck, duck, goose or something. These phrases have moved, but moreover, and this is really interesting to me, is that when the editors, whoever they were, first approached the works of Plato and were labeling things, and they gathered things together as the physics. Well, then there was other material, and that was after the physics, and so they came up with this sort of term metaphysics, but it's an accidental, problematic term that editors came up for, because what else are we going to call these things except after the physics? And so,
yeah. And this is still going on today. I think I might have mentioned it briefly in our epistemology episode, but there's a field of meta-epistemology. There's a field of meta-philosophy, which is kind of a modern incantation of metaphysics, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the categorizations of philosophy fall into the same problems that the actual act of doing philosophy falls into, right? You start trying to explain these things, and then you're still trying to find that initial basis from that you're actually springing off from. You're like, well, I'm in midair, so I must have sprung off of something, but where is it? So you keep rewording these definitions.
Yeah, this is where the language stuff comes in.
So what sort of things fall under the realm of metaphysics?
Well, I appear reductivist sometimes, but really two things. What exists? What can we determine that exists? That's the big question. And then what is existence? So what things exist, but what does existence even mean? And as you indicated a moment ago, that these questions are in many ways comprehensive in the sense that they cover all ground for all other topics in philosophy.
Yeah, and astute listeners might be thinking to themselves, well, so where does metaphysics end and epistemology begin then? Because this sure sounds like we're talking about how we know things, right?
This is like the problem with the Mercator map and trying to represent the world in a nice flat square when really the only representation of the globe that actually is proportionally even close to accurate is a globe.
Right.
Okay. So which then sort of makes borders almost useless.
Right.
If you look at a globe, I mean, so many globes have the lines painted on, but you start to think, well, that's really artificial, isn't it? And that's how I respond to that question. I certainly don't have the capacity to say, at this particular juncture, this is where we get into epistemology and we abandon metaphysics, because we really don't, because epistemology is a part of it. It's not the only part of it, but it goes there. It's like this, these pseudopods coming off of some gelatinous creature that just moves everywhere. There's the monster.
Yeah. So sticking with our metaphor of philosophy as being a building, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to ask, well, how's metaphysics holding up the roof, right? Well, no, if it's the floor and epistemology is a pillar, you need both things in order to have philosophy. So it doesn't really make sense to ask, well, how do we cleanly separate what these things are, right? Well, yes. The floor and the pillar are going to meet somewhere.
They're going to meet somewhere, but where do they meet exactly? That's excellent for the metaphor. Moreover, I would assert that metaphysicians would say, what makes you think that's a pillar? How do you know that pillar is even there?
So, a big arm of metaphysics is ontology. Can you want to go over, and this could be its own episode in itself.
Well, it has been. I mean, and we will again. But ontology is the study of being, which sounds very much like what is existence. And in fact, it is. So a lot of the ologies and isms fit under metaphysics. So what constitutes a being? What does it mean to have being? That's really on the existence side more than saying what exists. It's probably the slightly smaller question of metaphysics, I think.
Yeah, and so I'm sure that listeners get used to me just rambling through our intro, but we refer to the show as From Nowhere to Nothing, which is a quote from a philosopher, ontological oxymorons, right? And that pretty much defines the format of our show, right? Where we talk about things that relate to being, but lots of times they seem sort of contradictory or at odds or going against themselves.
Yes. Which
is certainly the way that this episode started off, right? Talking about metaphysics and epistemology and ontology and what the differences are between these things and how they work together.
Which are perfectly fine and welcome and necessary questions, but the best of humanity thus far hasn't been able to answer those.
Yeah.
But they still need asking. Right. I think this is partly maybe what some listeners will wonder after all this time. Why? And you've raised this frequently with an answer. Why do we keep asking questions? Because we want to know. Maybe fewer of us now than used to want to know, but I'm not so sure about that. I'm feeling more optimistic today. So we want to know, because to just be told there's an answer or the answer doesn't exist, so quit bothering yourself about it, it just sort of makes life a lot more gray.
Yeah, and when we say we want to know, that can really encompass a wide range of behaviors or attitudes, right? I had an interesting example this week on Facebook where a guy that I know posted an article about how Christians should be open to the idea that there's an old Earth, that there was a Big Bang and there was evolution and these sorts of things, and that's how the universe was created. And I was the first person to comment on this, and I encouraged the fellow because I had a feeling that there was going to be a lot of backlash to this. There wasn't. And as a matter of fact, there was a lot of people that I knew that I was very surprised said, this is a good article. Like, we need more things like this shared in the Christian community, right?
Interesting.
So, knowing, so it's kind of like we talked about when we were looking at, I can't remember if it was epistemology or skepticism. Skepticism is what it was. That skepticism, the snake eating its own tail, right? Wanting to know, you can want to know and ignore all of the evidence or all of the other viewpoints and say, well, I know that the earth is 6,000 years old, right? You can say that. But wanting to know can also mean being open to the fact that you're not going to know the answers, but there are things that you can know that sort of provide you with a picture or fuel for thought and fuel for other questions.
Yeah. That's interesting, that whole dialogue you encountered or were part of. As we're going through this episode today, I'm going to, not with desperation, but with intent, try to pull together a whole lot of things that we've been talking about. There's no closure. Nope, don't expect it. It's not. The series never ends. But when we talk about knowing, which we did both with skepticism and epistemology, both of which fit under metaphysics, if we're honest with ourselves, and what you were just describing, some people would say, I know the world is 6,000 years old. If we're really honest about all the things that we don't know, in Socratic fashion, if we really, I don't even know all the places my dad or my mom were in their lifetime. I don't know the order of every single car we were in. Mm-hmm. I don't know billions of things about even the life in which I grew. I find things out. I have to sort them. Are they accurate? Are they a hodgepodge of memory? We were talking about memory before the show. Memory itself is not particularly known for its absolute accuracy. And so to say that one knows that something is 6,000 years old, just as an example, would be to suggest a kind of objective fact, but really it is what people refer to in philosophy as a brute fact, the thing that no one can argue with, that is impregnable. And really, how many brute facts are there?
Right.
Even the determination of the 6,000 years old, just as pursuing the last part of that point, that was an estimation worked out numerologically through all kinds of investigation of the numerology in the Bible, so-called, but it wasn't an absolute, even when it was postulated.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of the viewpoint that I took, the comment that I put down, right? I don't go out advertising my personal beliefs, and I won't here. But what I said essentially was this, right? We can't know these sorts of things. And it would be very arrogant of us, if there was a God, to say that we know how he did things, right? So
I'm thinking of a line particularly from one of the older books that, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world?
Right. Yes. And there's things like that scattered throughout the Bible, as well as quotes like, a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day, right? There's lots of metaphorical language in the Bible. And so for us to pick and choose what we're deciding is literal and what we're deciding is metaphorical, when we're not the ones that wrote the book, and you're basing the fact that you're reading the book on some sort of assumption that you believe that this deity does exist, very arrogant to put down things that are set in stone. But I think that there's a comfort into that, right? There needs to be some sort of
people want to.
They want to know.
They want to know, but they want to know without.
But what type of knowing do they want?
Do you really want to know? Do you really want to know the incredibly complex development of sacred texts across the planet, which involve editing, decision-making on the part of what we would now call committees or the monarchs, rulers. This goes, this stays. Why? Sometimes based on scholarship, sometimes based on patriarchal intent, and the culture splits apart, comes back together. This group has these books, this group has these books. Somehow they form them back.
Yeah.
Do you want to know that? And if you don't want to know that and you just want to say, no, it's the word of a deity, okay, but not allowing yourself to know that is closing the deeper understanding of how human such books are.
Yeah, there has to be some critical thinking, right? Because like you were mentioning, there's several points throughout history, the Council of Nicaea and these sorts of things where the Bible was edited. Some things were put in, some things were taken out, that sort of thing. And also there's logical there's logical inconsistencies in some points where you say, okay, well, if the Earth is 6,000 years old, and if we have all of these lines of evidence that speak of evolution or the existence of dinosaurs or the cosmic microwave background, then logically bearing out the scenario, what I'm thinking is that God must have put these things in place to deceive us into believing that science is true, and now is requiring a gigantic act of faith on our part to find this esoteric knowledge of the Earth being 6,000 years old and flying in the face of what we know. That does not seem like something a benevolent God would do, right? It just doesn't. Why would you put all of these stumbling blocks in place?
Or why would you allow your negatively charged other to do that as well? No, it all speaks of pop quizzes and constant tests, and if it's all about a constant test, well, one wonders too. So that takes us into all kinds of things, including ethics,
right?
Which is what metaphysics does. It essentially says, I dare you to go anywhere. You're not going to find the ultimate answer, but you're going to find possible answers that cause you to rethink everything, which is often what you say about why you like to keep pursuing this stuff.
Exactly. And that's what I was just about to add is, as a philosopher, can I dismiss the 6,000-year-old Earth? Well, no, technically I can't, because you want to know what? I don't know, right? It would be just as arrogant for me to say that I know that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old as for me to say that I know it is. There's evidence leaning in one direction or the other. It'd be just as arrogant for me to say that I know a Christian God is the real God versus a different type of God. Yeah. There's a lot of, you have to be open. You're attempting as best you can, being born into a human body and being a subjective, participant in reality. You have to do your best to inhabit an objective space and to use logical lines of reasoning, and to not let some of those things color your judgment.
Really, one of the most interesting things that I tried to bring this up in class sometimes over the years. I think one of the most correlative and applicable processes regarding metaphysics, and people much more competent than I have written about these things, is that the practice of metaphysics is rather like literary criticism. And I was trained in literary criticism, right? But in the literary criticism world, there was a time that people split off into the theory being much more important than the actual practice. And so you became a deconstructionist. And what the deconstructive critic was saying was totally superimposed itself on whatever the author might have intended. And I think things went really haywire with literary criticism with that. But that being said, in literary criticism, you are investigating a text. You are looking at it very closely. You are taking lines and considering them. You're taking descriptions and you're looking at a through line of theme and trying to build an argument toward what the author might be intending, or toward what the characters happen to be doing. And you don't end up with an absolute, you end up with a considered position that you take on the Odyssey or whatever piece of Leaves of Grass by Whitman, whatever you're talking about. And it should be intelligent. It could certainly be passionate. It can go the range of both logic and passion, but it needs to be a reasoned argument. But ultimately, while you might convince some people that, yeah, that's a pretty compelling argument, you're not going to convince people that that's the only read of that particular Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
And that's what metaphysics does. Is let me lead you this way with some questions by asking the questions, what do I seem to come up with for the moment?
Yeah.
and okay, good enough for the moment, but it's certainly not meant to convince everybody.
Yeah, and that's an excellent example. And, where, like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, where metaphysics starts, and where philosophy starts to change over into epistemology and then change over into science, right? Like cosmology is a big one, right? Cosmology used to be a metaphysics practice. It's now almost entirely in the realm of science. There's been so many observations that have been taken with such precision that certain aspects of cosmology are still studied by philosophers, usually things that go back beyond the Planck length at the very beginnings of time. But for the most part, cosmology is a scientific study. That's where I feel as a philosopher, you can start to take more reasoned and hard stances on things, right?
Yeah.
So if we are talking about, like we were just talking about, things that can't be proven or disproven, metaphysical questions, right? About being, about
first causes.
Yeah, about all these things, right? We can never dismiss any of those things out of hand because we're never going to have the evidence to do so. But there are things that fall within the realm of science that we do have an accuracy about, we do have a knowledge about, that we can take a stand and say, no, this just doesn't seem to jive with what humanity has spent its entire existence building.
Now you come back to what Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a very interesting philosopher, partly what she did was pick up on the idea of the brute facts and said, okay, there are really two kinds of facts. There are and we talked about facts, in a different episode. Facts that depend for their existence on social structures, institutions, past practice, and then the brute facts that you can't necessarily change. Now, this presupposes some kind of reality or natural reality, and there's that in it. But as, for example, one of the examples that she presents is gold. Gold is gold. It exists. Let's say that it's a brute fact that gold exists. But the monetary system, which is based upon gold, which says this is what gold is worth this year, and which is, as with all economic systems, a great big game that everybody decides to play. They're forced into it. It's not like they decide to play. What else are they going to do? But those are facts that are created that are entirely dependent upon an institution, its solvency. Gold is gold. and so I think that's a useful way of trying to cross-reference. We think we know that there was a Big Bang or the equivalent. There was a beginning point of the universe. We don't know exactly how all of that works. We may not ever, but we keep trying. The Webb telescope, which is unfolding right now out toward 1 million miles away from us, is going to be able to show us things we haven't seen yet, which is exciting. But what we see, is it a brute fact, or is it based upon our own presuppositions of what we're looking at? Are we able to see by seeing, or are we seeing always through the veil and the lenses that have been cluttered around us?
Yeah, that's the question. And real quick technical point. So I said earlier, cosmology is mostly in the realm of science. There's another term, cosmogony, which talks about the beginning of the universe. That is still within the realm of philosophy, and that would be a real metaphysical question.
Yes.
You want to give us a recap real quick on the foundations of metaphysical philosophy?
Sure. First, Democritus and Leucippus and they became known as the atomists. They were suggesting that everything, particularly Democritus, was really interesting because way back then, so to speak, they were talking about the smallest things are atoms. And atoms cluster and make bigger things that we are able to see. But everything that we are aware of is made by atoms. And if you stop and think about that for a minute, and then realize that one of the most interesting presentations of that came much later with a philosopher poet named Lucretius, who wrote a poem about that idea. And it's beautiful and it's fascinating, and so it takes what we think of as perhaps a priori knowledge, theoretical knowledge. Democritus couldn't see an atom. He was postulating the atom. Not the atom we know from the atomic bomb, but that doesn't matter. The smallest part kind of thing. We'd call a particle, perhaps. And that gets rendered in literature in a way that becomes a lens or a veil for more accessibility. But it's essentially saying what exists. Atoms exist, and we go from there. Then we get into the Plato. I mean, I can't go through all of them. We don't need to do that. But the idea of there is an unchanging, eternal, perfect set of things called forms, capital F. And then there's the ordinary, imperfect, changeable world in which we live. And that's where we get start to get this duality of, oh, well, there's that realm and then there's this realm. How do we find the two? And then metaphysics says, but what would make you think that just because there are all these different trees that are shaped in different ways, why would you think you would have access to an idea of a perfect tree? That's when Plato starts to get questioned. Does the form exist in an ideal sense? Plato said that the only thing you can know is the absolutely perfect, unchangeable. How do we know that? Because we don't ever encounter it. Nothing is unchangeable in the world that we live. So he said everything else is opinion. You can't know anything that isn't perfect. And all you can do with that is to postulate that it's there. So I know that I think that I know that it's there. But everything else I just have an opinion about because I encounter it with my falsifiable and unchangeable and Frenchable senses. And so all of that is really the root of what becomes all across our discursive time and space frame, the idea of what exists and what does existence mean and how do we determine it?
Yeah. And Democritus with the atom, that's like an incredible feat of a priori knowledge, right? Just thinking your way back into that, like, it's wild.
And then Plato talks about anamnesis, which we didn't use the term this morning, but really we're talking about it. Plato suggested that the way to the forms was that we actually knew about them before we came into this world. Our birth removes all of that. And so education and learning is not about finding new stuff. It's about getting back to what we originally knew. Which is a very regressive way of looking at education. Can't as a teacher go with that, but it's still an interesting thing. Yeah,
it's wild to think that the time that the atom was first postulated, and then fast forward 2,000 years to now somebody won the Nobel Prize for finally imaging one of these things. That much later, the time scale is unfathomable. It's wild. Do you think you just gave me a book that I'm looking forward to read on Japanese philosophy? Mm-hmm. Are there any stark similarities or differences in metaphysical assumptions from different cultures?
There are, but I'm going to step lightly because I've only, in the past couple of years, much to my own shame and limitations, have begun to investigate that, which I should have been investigating a lot earlier, and finding books that seem to be of academic weight and still accessible to do this. And so I've found one by a gentleman named BT, it's been out there a long time, but I finally found it for me, about African religions and philosophy. And that's one I have coming for you too, so we can talk about this. And then the Japanese. But there's one, yes, there are differences, because part of Japanese philosophy is, if you could say there's one philosophy any more than Western, there's so many variants. But part of it is canted toward or by, not exclusively, but Zen or Buddhism or Shintoism, not religion per se, but that which doesn't require a separation into categories the way the Western world does. I've learned a lot from my Japanese students when I had the joy of being able to work with them. And, like all people, we were talking philosophy, but it was lightly and so on. But one of the concepts, and that book goes into it, is a thing called kokoro. Kokoro means, essentially, roughly translated, heart, mind. And kokoro involves not a separation of the two things. So even launching from that and asking, well, how do you know? Well, I know with my heart, I know with my mind, and they aren't two separate things. Opens up a whole scape of possibilities.
Yeah, and that's why I'm looking forward to talking about some of these different cultures in the future. Much like you, I have an embarrassingly small amount of knowledge of some of these other cultures, but I'm really curious to get into it. We just passed 5,000 listens yesterday.
Wow.
And a large proportion of these people, it's looking like, are regular listeners from places like India and Brazil and Japan and places around the world. So, I'd like to do the due diligence of talking about these people's things in a way that is not offensively,
right.
Simplistic
our
or
fellow
outdated.
Human beings are out there with all kinds of cultures and societies and ancient and current background. And I never want to appear as if I'm talking from an imperialistic or patriarchal place, because I'm not. Or let's say this, I strive not to. I think it's virtually impossible to extricate all of that because of all the training one has had, but to be aware of it and to try to be careful of it and to recognize it when it's there is a first step toward seeing the world more accurately. So I will not sit behind this microphone and try to tell people exactly what anyone's philosophy is with some kind of superior certitude. I can't do that. But to say, hey, look, we know there are these other ideas, and we're trying to find out more about those too. Maybe you know something. You can tell us a book we ought to be looking at.
And that's important because, and I think the listeners by this point, if you've listened to a bunch of episodes, you know that, because we don't even try to do that with Western philosophy, right? We don't sit here and try to act like we know anything because we don't. But the joy in admitting that you don't know anything means that you can look at ideas freshly and ask questions about them. And so that term that you were just talking about with the Japanese philosophy, the heart mind, right? Yeah. That reminds me of an article that I sent you earlier this week about people with hydroencephaly, where basically people who are missing the majority of their brain and their skull is just filled with cerebrospinal fluid. But these people live normal lives, right?
They are people, and they are equal with us as human beings. Yes.
And so that idea, the fact that somebody can live to be, live a long life, have a family, have a job, have all these things, right, without having a brain, flies in the face of Western ideas of ontology, right? Yeah. But a Japanese ontology might say, No, well, it's not just the brain that makes up a person, which is something that some aspects of Western philosophy have fallen into.
And this takes me back to the metaphysics idea of again, brute facts. Some metaphysicians say that there is one brute fact, and that is that something exists. And when I was reading that again this week, I always chuckle at that when I'm saying, how do you know? How can you assert that as an impregnable fact? I no longer can. When I was a kid, of course, when I was first studying and saying, well, of course we exist because I stubbed my toe the way some of the Hobbes and some of them were, Rousseau were poking at each other, so to speak. Well, I know that if I walk along and stub my toe, there's a stone there. Well, I know that I think I know that I have sensed an encounter with something.
And we talked about this last week with epistemology, right? And I use the information processing model of psychology, where your senses are not completely, but your senses are a separate thing from the cognitive processing that leads you to integrate the information about the outside world. So the raw data that's coming in, the light you're seeing, or the kinetic energy that's hitting your toe, or whatever it may be, is measurably different from what you are subjectively experiencing. And it raises all these questions, right? Yep. So yeah, metaphysics is fascinating, and it's my favorite because it asks these big questions that are echo throughout all of philosophy and in different areas. So let's talk about one of them. If the ship of Theseus was on Heraclitus River, right? What can we say about identity as a metaphysical problem?
Wow. Did you just say That's marvelous. So Heraclitus, to quickly review, Heraclitus says you can never step in the same river twice. Critics of Heraclitus said you can never step in the same river once. Right. Because of the nature of water and so on. Okay, fine. So now we're going to put the ship of Theseus on the river of Heraclitus. And the ship of Theseus is that, we've talked about it before, but really briefly, it's if Theseus, the hero, goes sailing out to his mighty quests and adventures, and not always mighty and not always honorable, and first it loses a mast and loses something else, and they keep replacing the parts. He comes sailing back in, and all the parts have been replaced. Is it still the ship of Theseus? And there's all right. So if you can't step in the same river more than once, and you're stepping on a deck that itself might have been replaced and isn't the deck that you started on stepping on, then can you really know much about identity? That's what you're, and this is where all the duality stuff comes. There were in the ancient world, essentially they're talking about two kinds of things: the material and the atomists were going there, and Aristotle was going there. So there's the thinking stuff, which is called res cogitans, and there's the extended stuff, the actual material stuff, and that's res extensa. And how do they communicate with each other? Well, we fast forward to Descartes, and Descartes said, well, there's mind and body. That sort of has taken an interesting split in metaphysical work, so that now in the 21st century and toward the end of the 20th century, the dominant mode was a monism toward the physicalism. It became called eventually. So that it's now we call it a neurological basis. Essentially, we say that the body accounts for all of the stuff that goes on. And we've talked about this in various ways. Okay, that was a quick run through. So if our identity is solely locked into or anchored in our experiences, as this shell tells us what the experiences are, because the shell of a body and this mind, this brain, interprets everything that we're seeing, and how our fluids and chemicals and magnetic activity are at any given moment is really what constitutes our identity. Because there is nothing outside, it's all us. Then if I'm sailing on that ship and on that problematic river, then I might be likely to say, well, it's the ship of Theseus as it currently is on a river that I know that I've given a name to, but the only thing I can know about that river is if I dip in some tubes and figure out what the constitution of the water is at mile 2, mile 3, and mile 4. So I'm an empiricist, and if that's how I'm viewing the world, and my identity is totally dependent on the empirical, phenomenological.
Yeah. All right. That's great. Yeah. And so you going through this whole scenario, right? Thinking about a more Eastern philosophy and thinking about more of those blurred borders and less of the dualism and stuff. That starts to look more appealing when you think about this, right? Rather than saying, okay, because the ship of Theseus and the river, right? These things are all metaphors also for us, right?
Yes, they are.
So, like you said, I think that there's all of us who have thought about it struggle with this idea. Am I the same person as I was when I was born, or when I was 5 years old, or as I was 1 minute ago? Or am I constantly changing and in fact a different person, and
what do we mean by different? We'd have to pick that up, because do we know that our epidermal layer changes with the frequency of foot in the time? I've forgotten what.
I believe
days, hours.
The last thing that I saw was that every cell in your body turns over once every 7 years.
Okay. So just physically, we would say, well, if we're just talking about our physical stuff, of course it changes. Well, we know that our physical self changes with age. We have lose some capacities. Perhaps we gain some other capacities. We adjust to our capacities. So there's a change in that. Are we the same person we were when we were born and knew nothing and went, well, now it's going to be like a Zen koan. Or I can't do a haiku out of this on the spot, but the seed, and we know the tree. What? Okay, so there's a seed for that oak, but do we know what the oak's going to look like? Well, we have an idea of what oak leaves look like. Do we know how many branches it's going to have? No. Do we know how tall it's going to be? No. Do we know it's even going to survive? No. So the baby as seed, we won't even go back to sperm and egg. Let's just go with the baby as seed. We do not know everything that is going to emerge in the life of that baby, or even in the physical nature of that baby itself. And if we can't know that, then how do we have the audacity to say that I'm the same person I always was? There's an attempt to be, to me, and this is just me, there's an attempt for the arrogance of certitude where it has no basis. I know how I was as a teenager. I think I'm really not the same person I was as then. Oh, there may be some personality characteristics on the surface that may exist. But for the most part, while I recognize who that was, I do not feel the being of who that was.
Right. So if all the physical stuff that made you up, all the boards on the ship have been replaced, and if the thread of identity that travels from birth until now, if you can look at that and say, well, no, I'm probably not the same person that I was, because I wouldn't make the same decisions or do the same things. It sort of removed some of those roadblocks into saying that we are the same person, which is something that sounds completely insane.
Well, but this is that physicalism thing. I remember having some really fascinating conversations with students over the years about this. When you put this out there, because first people are saying, "You're making my brain hurt."
Yeah.
Good. All right. So, mine too. But where do I stop being a person? And I think that this is what's so vitally important, is that we don't stop being a person, right? But if you measure humanity and humanness by, do you have a prosthesis? Do you have two prostheses? Do you have any mental health issues? Probably, documentably, all of us do, right? So there's no superiority there. Do we have this need to somehow be better than X, Y, or Z? There's no, maybe you can run better, you can play music better. Are there things that I can do? Yes. Is it relativistic? I'm not trying to make a relativistic mush. But if we define ourselves by how many teeth we have, how well our eyes function, how many spare parts have we had to put, and I say that with due acknowledgement of the horror that people go through and the pain in order to have prostheses. If we're the measure of just our parts, there's no whole that's more than. And I think metaphysics has taken me to the place to say, no, I have to, out of intuitiveness, if nothing else, reject the idea that I'm just only this.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of the big questions of metaphysics, right? Is cognition and consciousness, and this idea. And that's what's, again, the fascinating mysteries of philosophy, right? The fact that we're the most, our consciousness is so readily apparent in us. If there were other fully sentient beings walking around with the capability of language, I wonder how that would affect philosophy. But the fact that we appear to be the only ones, right? And we know other animals have these capabilities. This is a growing field, and that's opening up some of these questions. But with what we can do, with our ability to be meta, right? Our ability to look at our own thinking and examine it. That's what creates this feedback loop that is what philosophy thrives on.
It is.
So how do questions of necessity and possibility and causality shape our reality?
When you say questions of necessity, what do you? That's interesting. I like it, but can you help me out more with that?
Yeah. So metaphysics, I mean, we're coming down to saying, are there things that are necessary for existence? Are there things that are necessary for being?
To say something exists.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to derail your question. So say it a different way.
Yeah, I guess. So I'll build off of what we were kind of just talking about, right?
Yeah.
We have our ship of Theseus, and we have our Eastern philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it all kind of comes back to a question I asked a few weeks ago about quantum physics, right? And this sort of model of the universe that, maybe everything is part of a wave, or maybe there's a multiverse with several people in it, these sorts of things. So when we think about these sorts of questions and talking about, well, what makes it necessary to experience reality, or given the possibilities that we have concerning consciousness or the universe, or when we think about what caused everything that we're seeing, and we think about whether it's God or whether it's a quantum wave field or something like this, how do these shape the way that we fundamentally see reality?
Okay, this goes back to thank you. That was I appreciate you you qualifying. This is partly what Anscombe was talking about. It's partly what Hegel was talking about with this dialectical approach to things. It's not impossible, she might say, but it's very difficult to, and John Searle also talked about this, is to try to first recognize the veils you're seeing through, and then somehow find a way to just peek a little bit through those veils. I had an experience this week with my granddaughter that this helps. She wanted to look out the windows in the playroom. Great. But she said she wanted to let in the light. Well, there are blinds. So I said, okay, we'll open the blinds. No, Grandpa, no, not that not good. The blinds still there. Can't see everything, right? And oh, you want to open the entire shade? Yeah, so I opened it and went up part way. No. Wanted it all the way up. Okay. But then in the living room, there are curtains. And wanted to see if what this big tractor was that was going by. Well, you try to separate curtains. Sometimes curtains get right in the way of you try to separate, you can't find where the curtains meet sometimes. And you're fidgeting around and finally you open up and the tractor's already gone. Now, both of those things are different metaphors that I intend, but both of them go back for me to this thing you just asked, which is how do we try to see? If first, do we recognize that we are seeing through institutional societal training? Our whole culture right now is dealing with this stuff, and not particularly well, but we're starting. Because you have to recognize that there are things that have been artificially overlaid upon us as absolutes or as of courses, that you try to tease those curtains back and hope you're going to see something, at least for a moment, before the curtains slide back again. So I think its first step is requiring of oneself to ask what has really been pounded into me, so to speak, by genetics and generations, social training. And is it possible to still see with clarity, of some clarity, once I've said, nope, I know that I've got my glasses on. Let me take my glasses off. Do I see with more clarity? No. But I recognize that I have glasses. So can I describe what I see without my glasses? Yes. And it's not vastly different, but there's a fuzziness and an edginess to it. If I were put in a dark room, then try to say, without my glasses, what am I seeing? There's a point at which you can go so far with that you might not be seeing anything, but you might be hearing things. You might be sensing other things. So I think for me, that's what those folks have taught me.
Yeah, and it's a really abstract question, but there's concrete ways of thinking about it. And vision is a great one, right? Mm-hmm. One thing that always sticks out to me is like, if I'm ever in a twilight or in dark, I never realize that like I lose my color vision, right? You obviously do. Like if you think about seeing in the dark or in twilight, everything is in some sort of gray pallor because only rods are working in your eye. Your cones are just not receiving enough information to light up colors for you. But you never really, there's no sharp distinction of when that happens, right? I don't suddenly think that I'm seeing in grayscale. That's just sight. Or the fact that, you can, your nose is in your line of vision, but your brain just kind of
erases
it. Yeah. Or there's a point in your eye, right at the back of your eye, there's a section that does not reflect any light. So if you just unfocus your eyes and move your thumb throughout your field of vision, eventually there will come a point where your thumb will disappear. And that dead zone right in front of your face is always there, but your brain is just filling in gaps, right? Yeah, and when you bring it down to concrete terms like that and you realize, oh, wow, like these are things that are, as close as we can get in real life to saying these are facts, right? There's a fact that I have a nose, right? There's a fact that there's something out there in front of me. There's a fact that there's colors. And when you realize that your senses will not accurately portray that information to your brain. Then these big questions, right? Of, well, is there a God? Or, is some sort of reality outside of my senses? Or, well, all these big questions become much more interesting because, we have this strange experience.
I think that's marvelous encapsulation of this, because we can test these things. But what struck me when you just described it was the very fact of when you said, when we unfocus our eyes, think of the control that implies. I will unfocus my eyes. Well, or I will look at something out of the corner of my eyes as if my eyes were a square. Which corner am I looking? But when you want to look at a constellation like the Pleiades, and last week we talked about the idea that, well, there are stars, we make constellations out of them. We overlaid then a story that came from Greek mythology. The stars don't know that, right? But you have to, the best view of with your unaided eye of the Pleiades is to look out of the corner of your eye, not to look directly. It will be brighter. You will get more distinct of the blue, the separate 7 stars, and it's really fascinating. But that exacts or requires the enactment of control.
Yeah, and there's so many things like that just about ourselves, right? That you can unfocus your eyes, or that you blink, or your heart beats, or you breathe, and you don't think about these things, right? How much information lies below our consciousness, and then how that information is integrated by our consciousness. Mm-hmm. Again, one of the biggest questions in metaphysics.
Right.
And so, we've gone through just a couple of them today, and some of the most fascinating things that you can ask. And we've only really scratched the surface. I guarantee we will do other episodes on metaphysics down the road. And if not entire dedicated episodes, metaphysical questions will pop up on almost all of them. Yeah. But I think this has been a good introduction. So until next time, keep pondering.